Soon giving in this time, 'cause we're falling apart. Love didn't find your heart. Nights didn't count, lies didn't count at all. Love didn't find your heart. Silence didn't count, it tear us apart.
Boa noite, meus queridos e minhas queridas. Aqui estamos nesta noite de quinta-feira, 18h48 em ponto, começando mais uma live do Introdução, e hoje uma live muito importante. Tá? Hoje uma oportunidade única para nós brasileiros aprendermos com quem é possivelmente a maior autoridade do mundo em política de drogas. Claro que eu estou falando do nosso querido professor Sebastian Scheerer, professor emérito de criminologia da Universidade de Hamburgo, uma das mentes mais brilhantes com quem eu tive o prazer de conviver, uma pessoa de uma simpatia única, uma pessoa, né, de um carisma, de um carinho, de um coração do tamanho do mundo, certo? Eu não quero tomar muito tempo de vocês, mas eu acho importante, né, aproveitar esse comecinho da aula antes de nós começarmos o conteúdo propriamente dito para passar alguns recados para vocês. E o primeiro deles diz o seguinte: talvez vocês já tenham tentado clicar no botão, né, no linkzinho aqui embaixo para adquirir o curso, ainda não está disponível e eu vou explicar o porquê. Porque nós gostaríamos que vocês assistissem a aula até o final dela, para vocês terem certeza, né, do nível de qualidade desse material que foi desenvolvido, certo? É algo simplesmente fora da casinha, né? Nós fizemos um grande esforço nos últimos dias para legendar todos esses materiais. Acho que vocês vão gostar bastante, espero que vocês curtam bastante, e quero dizer que esse curso hoje, ao final, né, dessa live, ao final da aula da exposição do professor Sebastian, nós liberaremos um código específico, né, um link específico, na verdade, para que vocês possam continuar estudando, participar das outras 3 aulas que o professor Sebastian preparou para nós, com uma condição muito especial. E assim, quando eu digo muito especial mesmo. Nós estamos falando para quem ficar até o final dessa aula e quiser tomar a decisão de adquirir o curso, nós estamos falando num desconto de 50% no valor fechado. Mas atenção, porque as vagas são limitadas, certo? Esse valor, essa oportunidade só vai valer hoje, tá bom? Então, fiquem até o final dessa live, porque eu tenho certeza que vai valer a pena. Se não pelo desconto, certamente, pelo conteúdo que aguarda vocês. E com isso, sem mais delongas, eu quero passar, né, já o conteúdo. Esse que eu falei nossa, simplesmente uma das pessoas mais geniais que eu conheço, e uma pessoa com quem eu tenho o grande prazer de hoje, após já uns bons anos de parceria, chamar não apenas de professor, de mestre, mas também de amigo. Com vocês, o professor Sebastian Scheerer, da Universidade de Hamburgo.
Cairo, that's a great honor to be with you virtually and to be talking a little bit about a question that seems to have a very clear and very easy answer. And the question is doing drugs a crime? With doing drugs, I mean anybody who engages in the production, distribution, or use of drugs. Doing drugs in that sense is evidently a crime. We know that from our media consumption. Some know it from trying to get drugs or to hide drugs. And we all know by our everyday knowledge that is based on pragmatism, media consumption, and firsthand experience that engaging in drugs is a crime. So it should be difficult, really, to fill 1.5 hours with an attempt to make this question, to give an answer to this question, because the answer is so evident. And not only in Brazil and in Germany, but also everywhere in the world, the answer is quite clear. I have here a section of the Singapore Misuse of Drugs Act that tells us in clear words that anybody who is engaging in drugs, be it cannabis or anything else, is liable for criminal punishment. The Singapore law creates a presumption of trafficking for certain threshold amounts, for instance, 30 grams of cannabis. It also creates a presumption that a person possesses drugs if he possesses the keys to a premise containing the drugs, and that any person found in that place or escaping from that place is proved or presumed to be using drugs. So you risk not only arrest if you are in the company of somebody who has drugs, but also when you are close to a place where people are, or if you're trying to get away from that place. I cite the Singapore case because I think it's a rather severe one. It's by no means the severest in the world. And there are dozens of countries that have the death penalty for certain amounts of drugs. So it's by no means the worst one, but it's interesting nevertheless. You have in Singapore, you are presumed to be a drug dealer when you have 2 grams of heroin, 3 grams of morphine, 15 grams of cannabis raisins, 30 grams of cannabis mixture, 3 grams of cocaine, or what else do we have? 25 grams of crystal meth. And you expect a mandatory death penalty with 30 grams of morphine, 15 grams of heroin, 100 grams of cannabis resin, 30 grams of cocaine, or 200 grams of hashish, 250 grams of crystal meth. So that's a mandatory death penalty, and there is no way of getting around it. And Singapore happens to be not only one of the richest countries in the world, but also one of the countries that regularly do execute people for the possession of drugs beyond this threshold. So it's so evident that engaging in drugs is a crime that it is hard to make a different point. But this is actually what I want to do. I will try to argue today that while everyday knowledge tells us that engaging in drugs is a crime, scientific knowledge is able to cast doubt upon this thesis, and it is even possible by going a little deeper into legal theory and legal philosophy to actually contradict the conviction that everyday knowledge tells us that engaging in drugs is a crime. And that will really take a little bit of readiness to depart from everyday knowledge and to juxtapose it with scientific knowledge. And the relevant question, of course, is how do we get from everyday knowledge to scientific doubts and to a scientific argument at the end of which we can really contend that engaging in drugs is not a crime, but maybe it's an offense against the moral rights of the individual to treat engagement in drugs as a crime. Now, how do we start from everyday knowledge? We can start, of course, by saying what is a drug and what do we mean when we say engaging in drugs is a crime. For that, we have to look at what the law says, for instance, and what scientific knowledge says. A drug for pharmacologists, of course, is a substance that interacts with proteins in the body to affect a physiological function via the central nervous system. And we can categorize drugs in depressants that slow down the function of the central nervous system, and hallucinogenous drugs that affect your senses and change the way we see, hear, taste, smell, and the like, and stimulants that speed up the function of the central nervous system. Evidently, there are many such substances like ethanol found in alcoholic beverages like beer, wine, and spirits, or caffeine in coffee, tea, and cola nuts, or the nicotine in cigarettes that do have functions modifying the workings of the central nervous system, but that are not forbidden to sell or purchase or consume, and that are not crimes. So to produce cigarettes and to sell cigarettes and to possess cigarettes would not fall under the Misuse of Drugs Act of the state of Singapore, nor under the German Betäubungsmittelgesetz, nor under the Lei das Drogas of Brazil, nor any other drug law, except, of course, the state of Bhutan. The Kingdom of Bhutan is seemingly the only state that does not only prohibit the internationally controlled drugs, but also tobacco. They have a Tobacco Control Act of 2010, and they have a real prohibition of tobacco too, which, by the way, doesn't work any better than the prohibition of illegal drugs in other countries. So, since we know that ethanol, caffeine, and nicotine, and a lot of other substances that do affect the central nervous system are not considered drugs, we already have to qualify the sentence that doing drugs is a crime by saying that doing drugs is not a crime as such, but it is a crime to do some drugs like cannabis, heroin, cocaine, crystal meth, and others. Most people would say, well, the most dangerous drugs are the forbidden ones. But that is not quite the case. One counselor of the British government, Professor David Nutt, he was sacked by the Home Secretary of Great Britain in 2009 because he could show that it was not the most dangerous drugs that were forbidden. And when he publicized a different order of dangerous drugs that was not congruent with the drug policy in the world, he was simply fired by his political superiors. But this is not the central point. We can now say that doing drugs as such is not a crime because not all drugs are being criminalized. But that is quite trivial. But still, it's interesting to find that the definition of drug by the law is different from the definition of drug by pharmacology, and the legal system just tends to say drugs are the things that are being forbidden in this law. And so it's a kind of a vicious circle to just define things by saying, well, what we define as such is as such. But this is not the central point. When we want to have a scientific look at drug legislation and this question, we can also turn our attention to the everyday knowledge and to the difference between everyday knowledge and scientific knowledge when it comes to the term crime. Is there a difference between the two types of knowledge regarding crime? And could that be as relevant to the answer to our question as the definition of drug? This question is often overlooked because most people think, well, our everyday knowledge of what is a crime is not different from scientific knowledge. Scientifically speaking, though, we do have a big problem with crime. While the term crime does not have any simple and universally accepted meaning, we may start with the most current definition. According to the Oxford Companion to Law, there we find an article on crime, definitions of. And this article says there are quite a variety, but normally the definition most used of crime is that crime is something that is declared as such by the relevant and applicable law. At first glance, this definition seems to support the conventional everyday knowledge of doing drugs is a crime, because it is being declared to be a crime by relevant and applicable laws. For instance, the German Betäubungsmittelgesetz, or a lei número 11.343, do 23 de agosto de 2006 no Brasil. At first glance, the relevant and applicable laws are national in character, but they are even more than that. They are even more important because national drug laws, they really, in reality, they are not being made by national legislatures and national governments, but the contents of national laws are all coming from other parts of the world. They are all coming from Austria. They're coming from Vienna, and in Vienna we have the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, the CND of the United Nations. This Commission on Narcotic Drugs, consisting of 53 member nations of the United Nations, defines which drugs are to be taken into or eliminated out of the international control system of drugs. Practically nobody knows who these 53 member states are, who the individuals are who decide on this or how they do. Nobody knows in most countries that the names of the drugs that are forbidden by criminal law are not at the discretion of national legislatures, but that national legislators just have to follow the orders of an international body that sits or meets twice a year in Vienna, in Austria. It is Vienna, Austria, a certain little island of the city of Vienna in the middle of the Danube River, where they meet and they decide which drugs are to be criminalized in the whole world. In Germany, in Brazil, in Ghana, in Botswana, in Singapore, the individual countries do not have the right to criminalize less drugs than this Commission on Narcotic Drugs defines. We do have the right in Germany and in Bhutan to criminalize more drugs. And a number of countries, they make use of this right, but no country in the world has the right to criminalize less drugs than is being prescribed by the Commission on Narcotic Drugs in Vienna. So the individual legislations of individual countries materially is not national legislation. It is only formally national legislation. It looks as if the German government and the German parliament would decide, but in reality, they only transport an order that comes from the United Nations into national law. The real seat and the real origins of the criminalization of drugs is in the United Nations, and within the United Nations, it's within the Economic and Social Council, and one of its organs. One of the functional organs of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations that sits in Vienna and not in New York is the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. They decide which drugs are being criminalized in Singapore or in Germany or in Botswana or in China or Russia or the United States. Not even the United States is free to criminalize less drugs than the United Nations prescribe. So, in a way, materially speaking, the seat of the legislature is not the nation state, but the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. They are the material legislator in terms of drugs. The national legislators, they just transpose a centrally defined order into their national law. In that sense, the national drug legislation is just a dummy, it's a sham, it's a facade behind which there is an international legislator, as if we lived in a world state already. That makes it very hard to change legislation, to decriminalize especially, and we will see later on in one of the next sessions that some countries are trying to defect from this international order, which drugs have to be criminalized and which legal problems arise because of these defections of the international conventions. But for today, it's important to know that national legislation is not really competent to change the number of criminalized drugs, especially to reduce the number of criminalized drugs. There is always the possibility to prohibit tobacco, to prohibit alcohol, as is being done in many Muslim majority countries, but there's not a legal possibility of criminalizing less drugs in one country or the other. So at first sight, this fact even underlines the knowledge that we have from an everyday type of living, that engaging in drugs, of course, is a crime. It's not only a crime because it's a crime according to national laws, but even more, there's even more emphasis on the criminal character because international law tells all governments in all countries of the world what they have to criminalize. And there is Article 3 of the Convention on the illicit traffic on illicit drugs, the Vienna Convention of 1988. Article 3 of the Vienna Convention of 1988 says that all countries have the obligation not only to criminalize the production and distribution of these more than 100 drugs in the world, but they also are obliged to criminalize the mere possession of these drugs. That is an explicit order by the Article 3 of the 1988 Convention against the illicit traffic in narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances, the Vienna Convention of 1988. So it's not only relevant and applicable, it seems, the law in each country, but it's even immutable. The single national legislature cannot change it. We are not sovereign in the sense of our drug legislation. So, of course, doing these drugs, engaging in the production or distribution of these internationally prescribed drugs, of course, is a crime, and it has to be made a crime. Now, as somebody who is not only bound to everyday knowledge, but also to scientific knowledge, I think there is one interesting term, and that is when we go back to the new Oxford Companion of Laws article on definitions of crime, they speak of relevant and applicable law. From a positive point of view, of course, these laws and international conventions are applicable. But there are two entrance doors into making it a little more complicated and a little more intellectual. The first one is that all these conventions, they have certain formal reservations. They say something like, with due respect to the constitutional order of each signatory, we find that every country has to criminalize the possession of these and those drugs. But they always have this formula, a sort of a rhetorical formula that pays respect to national constitutional law. And this, of course, makes it questionable if all orders that come from the Commission on Narcotic Drugs in Vienna are really applicable. For one thing, the international conventions that determine the contents of national drug legislation, they are not self-executing, but they have to be transported into national legislation. This is why every time the convention is changed, the national legislatures have to change the law or the appendix, the schedules of the respective laws. Secondly, this rhetorical reservation that the international conventions pay respect to the constitutional order of the respective countries. It does have a certain meaning that is hidden to most politicians. Most politicians believe, well, we just have to transpose what the Commission on Narcotic Drugs says into our national law. And this is being done by almost monthly routines. The Commission on Narcotic Drugs is very eager to put all new drugs under the reign of the convention. So there's a permanent augmentation of the number of prohibited drugs, and all national legislatures, they simply follow these orders. But there are different countries in the world. There are some countries that are authoritarian. There's a minority of countries that takes human rights seriously and that has individual basic rights. And these countries, they might have difficulty in their constitutional law of simply prohibiting and criminalizing drugs, be it the possession or the distribution or the production, with respect to the basic rights of their citizens. And as a matter of fact, we know in legal theory that when there are laws that contradict basic moral rights of the individual, then these laws are considered unconstitutional. And unconstitutional laws, they can either be declared ineffective from the day that the Supreme Court reaches a verdict of inconstitutionality, or they can be called null and void from the beginning. That is, legally, they are being treated as if they had never been enacted. That is especially the case when criminal laws are being found to be unconstitutional. This is, for instance, a part of positive law in Germany. In Article 78 of the law on the Constitutional Court of Germany, Bundesverfassungsgerichtsgesetz, Article 78, it says that when the court finds a criminal law to be unconstitutional, then the consequence the legal consequence is nullity ex tunc and not ex nunc, meaning that legally things have to be treated as if this unconstitutional law had never been passed and had never been in effect. A case to illustrate that would be what Gustav Radbruch called legales Unrecht, legal injustice, a law that does not even fulfill basic requirements of justice, is null and void. Radbruch developed that theory in his Radbruch formula in 1946, it seems. But we don't have to go into Radbruch's legal theory to acknowledge that there is something like nullity ex tunc, even in positive law, even in Germany. But this is not only some idiosyncrasy of German law, but it is a matter of basic arguments in the philosophy of law, that of course you have a hierarchy of norms, and when a law of a lower status in this hierarchy is not compatible with a law of a higher status, then the lower status law has to cede way, to give way to the principles embodied in the higher level norms. So the question really that arises from a scientific point of view is engaging in drugs a crime when looked at from a legal philosophical point of view? And this cannot be answered with just yes or no by decision, but we have to find arguments that would either support the theory that it is okay to criminalize drugs, or that it is unconstitutional, not only in the context of one country, but in the context of all countries that subscribe to the rule of law and to the legal traditions that do recognize the existence of moral rights of individuals. Not all legal orders in the world do recognize the individual rights, even though most countries adhere formally to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There are a majority of countries that have a completely different interpretation of them and do not have the tradition of the Western civilizations and their emphasis on individual rights. Also, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not accepted as being superior to individual constitutional rights in different regimes, dictatorial or not. So I'm speaking of a small group of democratic countries, and not only of a small group of democratic countries, but of a small group of democratic countries that subscribe to the rule of law and to the existence of moral rights of individuals. These countries, I will argue, they will not be able to legitimate the existence of criminal laws that punish the recreational use of psychoactive substances for personal reasons of the pursuit of happiness. I will mostly base my arguments on a book that exists in Spanish, Drogas y Derechos, but the original, of course, is from Douglas Husek, Drugs and Rights, Cambridge University Press, Douglas Husek, 1992. This is the first and most serious analysis of the moral rights involved in drug use and drug legislation. And at the end of this argument, we will come to the conclusion that there is no way of legitimizing the criminalization of recreational drug use by adults that would not contradict all principles that are otherwise being applied to the question of criminalization and not criminalization. In the end, it will be an analogy to the criminalization of consensual homosexual behavior among consenting adults. These laws have been found to be unconstitutional after many, many decades when people have been criminalized and even put to death for just exercising their sexual preferences. Today we know that it is simply unconstitutional, a violation of moral rights of people if we criminalize their sexual orientation. Today that is clear, but for many decades that has not been clear at all. And on 22nd of July 2017, the German legislature has acknowledged that those gay people who had been in prison in Germany because of this legislation, they had the right to be compensated. People were freed immediately, of course, and those who had been in prison, they had all now the right to be compensated by the state because the state admitted that to treat homosexuals as criminals was a crime in itself, and it was wrong. And the state had to admit this wrongful behavior. And as I said, the 22nd of July 2017 was a great day in Germany because there was a law passed that acknowledged formally the right of formerly imprisoned gay people to be compensated by the state for this state injustice. I think the same is true actually for those people who are in prison because of their preference in recreational drugs, just because they don't smoke Camel cigarettes and they smoke joints, or they take crystal meth or whatever. This is a matter of the choice of drugs and the drugs of choice, and there should be the right to choice not only in matters of the sexual orientation, of religion, or if you're vegetarian or not, or if you eat coxinha or if you don't eat coxinhas. This is a matter what you do with your body, and this is the most basic right the individual has in the tradition of civil liberties. The most basic right is it's your choice if you want to be vegetarian or not, if you like churrasco or not. And what kind of drink you drink, what kind of food you take, what kind of hairdo you want, how you wear your shirts and your pullovers. This is all the presentation of self, the making of self, the identity of the person, the most basic question. And the question which drugs you prefer is no less worthy of attention and of being given the dignity of a right than any of the other examples I just cited. It might look trivial to say that if you want to eat ice cream, vanilla ice cream or chocolate ice cream, that this is a right. But coming to think of it, would we really like to live in a society where there was no right to choose what you eat and drink, and just a permission? Just would we be content if the state would just permit us to have ice cream, but would not permit us to do other things? We don't need permission, not in the Western tradition of individual rights, but we have these rights. And so there is, in our Western legal philosophy, it's a big difference between possibilities which we call rights and possibilities which we call permissions. To make it clear, if I say it's my right to drive on the left-hand side of the street and everybody else drives on the right-hand side of the street, I might run into problems. And the question would be, Sebastian, is it really your right to drive on the left-hand side of the street if everybody drives on the right-hand side? People would say, no, it has nothing to do with your identity and with natural law. You cannot possibly base your will to go on the left-hand side of the street on anything like a right that belongs to your autonomy as a citizen. So the question, left-hand side or right-hand side in traffic, is a question of mere convention and of mere permission. The state has the right to regulate if everybody in Germany goes on the right-hand side of the street or on the left-hand side of the street with his or her car. That is not a question that is basic to the autonomy and to the identity and to the moral right of a person. It's a matter of expediency, what the state thinks is the most practical thing to do. But there is a catalog of basic rights like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of sexual orientation, freedom of doing whatever you want as long as you don't interfere with the rights of others. And there's a freedom of the pursuit of your own happiness that has to do, according to Harry Frankfurter and other legal philosophers, especially with your sphere of identity and who you want to be. And who you want to be is being expressed and constructed by clothing, by food, by hairstyle, by all these presentations of self in everyday life, among other things. But this belongs to the most basic things. And so, of course, we have to deal with the everyday knowledge that tries to justify the criminalization of recreational drug use by adults. There are at least two strains of arguments that we have to deal with. One is, it could be that there is a moral right for the state to criminalize recreational drug use because it does harm to those who use drugs. There are quite a few people in the official drug discourse, including in the United Nations and the United States, that say, well, these drugs are so dangerous, we have to criminalize them. Otherwise, people will destroy their own characters. They will become unable to work. They will become unwilling to work. They will become addicted just thinking of drugs. They will not be able to have a productive family life or social life. And that could endanger the very basis of society and the state. So in order to protect families, societies, economies, and the functioning of the whole, we just have to decide to criminalize, to prohibit these most dangerous drugs. And we all know, and I certainly have known over the decades, innumerable persons who have ruined their lives and their families' lives by being addicted to drugs, legal and illegal drugs. So there's no reason to take this lightly. The question should be, though, if these drugs are so dangerous that they practically finish everybody who uses them, why are there still so many drug users in the world and seemingly alive? The rhetoric about the dangerousness of these drugs stems from a generalization of worst cases. They do exist, these worst cases, but can we organize the legal classification of these drugs according to these worst cases, or are we falling into a bias and into an empirical trap? We all know, and I certainly have known a lot of people who ruined their lives and those of their families by excessive alcohol consumption. But still, alcohol is not prohibited. It has been prohibited in the United States between 1920 and 1933, and we will return to that case of the United States alcohol prohibition probably tomorrow. But as for the international drug control system, alcohol is not being prohibited. And this for good reason, because there is only a minority of alcohol consumers that really kill themselves with this drug. And this does not affect the right of the beer drinker in Germany and of the wine connoisseur in France or Spain or southern Brazil to use these drugs. And it's basically the responsibility of the user himself or herself to do something about it when he or she gets into trouble, or of the family and friends and the state's counseling services. To say differently of methamphetamine or cocaine or cannabis is simply a fallacy that takes it for granted that the cases that we see in the media of people who ruin their lives with these illegal drugs, they are typical for the adult users of these drugs. And that is simply not the case. The percentage of users of illegal drugs that ruin their lives by using these drugs is not higher than the percentage of illegal drugs. The media just show us the most terrible cases, but they normally do not show the cases of the more than 90% of users that use these drugs with pleasure and with benefits for themselves, and who like them and who are very attached to these recreational drugs, and they profit from these drugs. One of the first ones to admit his use of heroin and a number of further illegal drugs is Carl Hart, the first Black tenured professor at the Natural Sciences departments of the Columbia University in New York. I think he is the first one who openly admitted his use of illegal drugs in his latest book, The Drug Use for Grown-Ups. He's a professor of neuropsychology. He's been doing empirical research on the effects of drugs on the central nervous system of both animals and humans, and certainly one of the most renowned textbook authors of the effects of drugs on the human brain. And he says he's been using these substances, and he's using them all the time, and with very good effects. And that's actually the first time I have read about these completely integrated, productive users of illegal drugs. If more people were able to talk like this about their drug use, I think we would have a less distorted view of these substances, and it would be easier to show that illegal drugs are no different from legal drugs in that respect. Most people, when we talk about the legalization of drugs, they think it is enough to say, well, there are counterproductive effects of criminalization, and this is why we have to legalize. And there are, in my counting, at least 15 problems of ineffectiveness, inefficiency, and counterproductivity of the current drug laws. But would we ever have used utilitarian arguments to speak about the legalization or illegalization of homosexual behavior? Would that really be a good way? Should we say, well, what are the advantages and the disadvantages of gay behavior? Should that be the criterion for the question if we legalize homosexuality or not? Or shouldn't it be a principled argument? Shouldn't we have a principle of either stating there is a right or there is no right for homosexuals to live like they want to live? We should not make it a utilitarian question of advantages and disadvantages for society. We should make it a question of principle. If people who are gay have the right to live their sexuality, or if they don't, without our asking what are the advantages and disadvantages for society. It's a matter of rights and not of advantages, of utilitarian calculus. I think the same is true for the question of drugs. We should not point only to the fact that it is futile to criminalize drugs, because there will always be people who use drugs. It will never be possible to prohibit drugs effectively for everybody. It will not be enough to just say people will lose their faith in the law when they see that millions of people are breaking the law. It is not enough to say the criminalization of drugs is a way of giving money to organized crime. Of course, prohibition does feed organized crime. It's a method of seeding corruption. There would be much less corruption, much less organized crime. Organized crime would not be able to make billions and billions of dollars every year without the criminalization of drugs. All these disadvantages of prohibition are clear. They are open for everybody to see. But the big question concerning legalization or criminalization should not be utilitarian in nature, but it should be the question of principle. Is there a moral right for grown-ups to use drugs, or is there not? It's like, is there a moral right for homosexuals to live their sexuality, or is there not? And the question of harm to self, that drugs harm the users, is not enough to prohibit. There are so many things that harm people, and still these things are legal. Look at wingsuit flying, base jumping, big wave surfing, motorsports, kite flying, ice diving, horseback riding, free climbing, alpine skiing, climbing the Mount Everest. The death rate of mountain climbers in the Himalayan mountains is much higher than the death rate of any drug users. So it's simply not enough to say drugs are harmful for the users, and this is why we can prohibit them. Another question is if drugs are harmful for other people, and if maybe that would be a reason to prohibit them. The idea of harm to others is much more serious, and we have to take it serious that drug use can lead to physical crime, to rape, to murder. There's a lot of drug-related crime, and maybe using drugs can be the source of criminal behavior, like taking alcohol can be the source for people to kill other people with whom they are getting into a fight. This is the big chapter in legal theory of endangerment offenses, of crimes of endangerment. In German, abstrakte Gefährdungsdelikte, or I think delitos de perigo abstrato in Brazilian. We do have a number of these endangerment crimes in our criminal codes, and it is possible to try and defend the criminalization of drugs by pointing to the existence of these endangerment crimes. They are a growing class of criminalizations in contemporary criminal law. But we cannot simply assume that any risk can be criminalized. There are so many risky behaviors that we have to have criteria for when it is okay to criminalize a risky behavior that poses a risk to other people. Because if we don't have that, then we could simply criminalize every exercise of individual rights by pointing to the risk that they might pose for something to happen to others. So, as we know, criminal sciences, the penal law dogmatics, they have a whole catalog of criteria when it is okay to criminalize risky behavior that poses a risk to others, for harm to others. And that, I would say, the most important criteria in that respect are the principle of relevance, the triviality principle, the risk, the behavior, the harm to others that is being created as a risk should not be trivial, it should be serious. So the damage must be serious that is being done to other people. A drug that would make everybody who takes it so aggressive that there is an empirical chance of a substantial kind that the person might attack another person or kill another person, that would not be a trivial damage. And if that could be shown that the use of drugs is causal, if there's a causality, a causal link between taking the drugs and this risk to materialize, then of course there might be a point of criminalizing to take this drug. But that would have to happen on quite a regular basis. If it doesn't happen on quite a regular basis, in many cases, then the way we treat alcohol would be the only viable solution. We do not prohibit the manufacture of alcohol, and we do not prohibit the distribution of alcohol just because some people under the influence of alcohol attack other people, or because they create traffic accidents. This does happen, but it is enough to criminalize the very act of drunken driving, or to criminalize the very act of causing an accident while under the influence of alcohol. We do not punish the producer of alcohol because some people misuse alcohol. So we do not punish the producers of cars just because some people use cars to kill other people or to kill them by negligence. We do punish people for negligent manslaughter when they kill by negligence other participants in traffic, but we do not punish the production of cars on the distribution, selling, and purchasing of cars. The same is true with wine and beer. Even though they constitute a certain risk, a certain abstract risk for people to misuse them and to damage other people, to do harm to other people, we do not prohibit the production and distribution of alcoholic beverages. This would be exactly what we should do with cocaine and heroin and opium and all these other illegal drugs. It would be completely enough to have legal markets for all these drugs and only to criminalize the negligent infliction of harm or the intentional infliction of harm under the influence of these drugs to third persons. That would be completely enough. It is far too long a chain of events that leads from the production of cannabis to the killing of somebody. The rationale today why we prohibit cannabis in a way is the following. There is a cultivation of cannabis, then there is somebody who sells cannabis to somebody else, maybe to a young person. The young person is getting used to illegal drugs, switches to heroin, switches to crack, goes and is member of a juvenile gang that distributes crack at a point of sale, gets into a fight with somebody else from a different gang, and then kills this other person of the different gang. But this is a chain of events with so many bifurcations that it is far too long a chain of events that we could still reasonably say that the cultivation of cannabis is worth criminalizing because it leads to all these things. There's simply no proximity between the act that is criminalized as an endangerment and the harm that is being done to other people. That's far too long. And we recognize that this chain of events is far too long in the case of alcohol. We do not criminalize the production of alcohol just because somebody somewhere might get drunk and kill his neighbor. Of course, that is terrible and it has to be punished, but it has nothing to do with the production of alcohol. There are so many decisions on the way that it is simply not coherent, and it does not fulfill the criteria that are to be used when deciding the question if or if not a crime of endangerment can be constituted. So, in a way, I think we have to differentiate between jurisprudence and jurisdiction. In jurisdiction today, of course, engaging in crime, doing drugs is considered a crime. Most jurisdictions still believe that the laws against drugs are constitutional, even in countries that do cherish human rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But in jurisprudence, we cannot simply follow jurisdiction. Jurisprudence is a relatively independent discipline. And when we look at the example of the criminalization and decriminalization of homosexuality, we find that first there was a discussion in jurisprudence about the human right of having one's own sexuality. And then there came later on the illumination of jurisdiction that said, yeah, that's true. It's unconstitutional to criminalize gay people for gay behavior. The same will happen here. Today, of course, everyday knowledge still believes that doing drugs is a crime because there are laws and because there is a jurisdiction that follows these laws. But as with the legalization of homosexuality, there's already a very good, very solid proof in jurisprudence, in legal theory, that it is untenable to criminalize the recreational use of certain drugs by adults. There's simply no good argument that can justify the criminalization of recreational drug use by adult citizens of countries that otherwise subscribe to the existence of moral rights of the individual. So, whereas everyday knowledge says doing drugs is a crime, scientific knowledge, and especially jurisprudential knowledge, comes to quite a different conclusion. And the conclusion is that doing drugs is not a crime. These drug laws, they are null and void ex tunc, because they are such a blatant transgression of moral rights of the individual that there is no way of keeping them valid or of doing as if they had been valid. Just as in the case of homosexuality, people have to be treated as if these drugs had never existed, because they are a blatant contradiction to fundamental rights. And people have to be compensated for being persecuted, discriminated, or imprisoned because of these rights. The jurisprudential answer to the question if doing drugs is a crime is no, it's not a crime, but it is a criminal offense if the state treats adults who use drugs for recreational purposes as criminals. That is in itself a violation of human rights, and it needs to be redressed and compensated, just as in the case of imprisoned homosexuals. As Terry McKenna once said, if we don't take the right of individuals to experiment with their consciousness freely and without punishment, if we don't take these rights seriously, and if we don't acknowledge this right, then the Declaration of Independence of the United States is not even worth the hemp that it was written on, because this Declaration of Independence really was written on hemp paper, and that is a very good point. It's a basic human right to decide oneself which drugs to take, which food to eat, which drinks to drink, and of course, which substances to take for recreational purposes. One of these days in the future, it will not only be clear to people who know jurisprudence, but to everybody. It will be as clear that recreational drug use is a human right as today it has become clear to everybody in the world that homosexual behavior, of course, is not a crime, but it's a right of everybody who feels like it. And that is my message for today.
É isso, meus queridos! O que acharam aí dessa baita aula do professor Sebastian? Ah, tenho certeza aí que, eu estava acompanhando os comentários, respondendo todos eles na medida que conseguia. Acho que, a resposta de vocês foi muito positiva. Fico muito feliz com isso, porque, no final das contas, é esse o nosso objetivo, certo? É trazer o conteúdo criminológico crítico mais perto de vocês. E com isso, eu quero falar, então, sobre o nosso curso completo, certo? Eu vou liberar o link daqui a pouquinho, quero só explicar como é que vai funcionar. É o seguinte, como o professor Sebastian, professor alemão, né, nós incorremos uma série de cursos para trazer ele, para conseguir que ele tivesse a participação que ele teve na produção desse curso, né? E ele é um cara simplesmente genial, mas como, né, nós partimos do pressuposto que todo professor, né, deve ser remunerado de forma justa, né, de uma forma um pouquinho diferente do que tantas outras instituições fazem nesse nosso país, e como, né, a relação real e euro não está muito fácil, esse é um curso que, né, via de regra, que no seu valor cheio não vai ser o curso mais barato que a gente já fez, certo? Só que, como nós também sempre falamos, nós temos um compromisso muito grande com quem está engajado em participar, quem está aqui, quem está assistindo, quem assistiu ao vivo, e isso para nós vale muito. E é por isso que hoje nós liberamos, né, um preço muito especial com 50% de desconto sobre o valor do nosso curso, certo? Esse é um curso que vai custar R$ 397 no seu valor cheio, mas hoje, exclusivamente hoje, até às 9 horas da noite, porque eu só quero que se inscreva quem de fato participou dessa aula ao vivo. Esse é um curso que vai estar saindo por R$ 197, né? Valor parcelável aí em 12 vezes, lá pelo PagSeguro, acho que tem uma taxinha que você paga, mas galera, é a melhor condição que esse curso vai aparecer e que nós conseguimos fazer, né? Essa é a nossa forma de agradecer a vocês por terem participado dessa aula e de incentivar vocês a participarem desse curso fantástico, né? São 4 aulas no total, 4 aulas onde o professor Sebastian vai trabalhar diversas perspectivas da política de drogas, desde a sua origem, quem foram os primeiros regimes proibicionistas, quais as relações, inclusive em termos de debate que eu vi rolando por aí, entre a ideia de individualismo, a ideia de comunitarismo, a ideia de coletivismo. Ele entra em alguma medida nesses pontos, especialmente a partir das nossas provocações a ele. E o Cláudio está perguntando se são mais 4 aulas. Não, são mais 3 aulas. Essa primeira aula vai ficar disponível gratuitamente para todo mundo que tiver interesse, certo? E quem quiser se inscrever, pode aproveitar até 21 horas de hoje, tá? Para conseguir fazer a sua inscrição para todo este curso com 50% de desconto, por apenas R$ 197, que dá para parcelar, e tem, nossa, N chances de vocês fazerem, aceita boleto, aceita Pix, aceita todo jeito aí para que de fato vocês possam participar desse curso, fazer essas aulas, certo, minha gente? Eu acho que a aula do professor Sebastian fala por si mesmo, não tenho dúvida de que vocês conseguiram ter um pouquinho da dimensão do tamanho da intelectualidade desse homem. Ele é simplesmente fantástico, ele é uma pessoa, nossa, gente, absolutamente inspiradora em diversos aspectos, e como eu disse, né, é uma pessoa que dá gosto de falar que eu tenho muito orgulho de falar que hoje já é meu amigo. São 8 horas de curso no total, certo? Sempre 1h30 de aula seguida de um debate de mais ou menos uma meia hora, trazendo perspectivas importantes, questionamentos que dizem respeito também à nossa realidade, enfim. Tem certificado, certo? O certificado está incluso no programa. E, de forma única, né, todas as aulas são legendadas e elas podem ser assistidas imediatamente, certo? A partir do momento que você comprar o curso, já vai estar liberado, você já vai poder assistir todas as outras 3 horas. Se você quiser fazer uma maratona hoje para assistir, dá, não tem problema, dá para assistir ao longo da semana, não tem erro. O curso vai ficar disponível por 90 dias a partir do momento que vocês fizerem a inscrição de vocês, certo? E, eu acho que se você está buscando mais informações para desenvolver o teu TCC, para desenvolver a tua pesquisa, né, você está na pós, está procurando uma perspectiva que possa te encaminhar por esse debate que é central, que é um debate que cada vez mais nós percebemos, né? Quando nós falamos em política de drogas, nós estamos falando em política criminal. Quando nós estamos falando em o que mata no Brasil hoje, né? Será que é o consumo de drogas ou será que de fato é a política, a reação que existe ao consumo, à venda, à distribuição, à produção, como o professor Sebastian falou, né? Qual que é a taxa de mortalidade de fato que nos importa, que nos interessa? É isso que eu tenho, é isso que eu tenho. São 120 dias, aliás, acabaram de me colocar aqui, verdade, para esse curso nós até colocamos mais 30 dias para vocês, deixa eu até confirmar aqui para não falar bobagem, né? Mas acho que a gente até colocou mais 30 dias para vocês justamente por ser um curso em inglês. A gente quer que vocês possam pausar, possam assistir, possam voltar, tudo isso, porque são argumentos densos, são argumentos que a gente precisa retornar sempre. E o bom da plataforma do Introdução é isso, né? Os nossos alunos que estão aí nos assistindo também podem atestar. O fato de você poder sempre pausar, assistir em velocidade maior, em velocidade menor, né? Você ter toda a liberdade de assistir quantas vezes você quiser. Isso diz muito, acho que, sobre o compromisso que nós temos em relação a garantir que seja de fato uma experiência produtiva para vocês. Que seja uma experiência que vocês de fato aproveitem, né? E é isso, meus queridos. O link está liberado. Tá certo? É só você clicar aqui. Eu vou jogar aqui nos comentários também para vocês aproveitarem e fazerem a inscrição de vocês. Ele já é para estar liberado, tá certo? É www.introcrim.com.br/drogas-curso. Vamos colocar aqui para vocês. Deixa eu jogar aqui na telinha completa para que vocês não se percam e vocês realmente possam participar. Mas atenção, né? Eu já falei e vou repetir. Esse é um programa, esse é um desconto que vai ficar disponível apenas até as 21 horas. Certo? Só entrar nesse endereço que eu acabei de jogar aqui, introcrim.com.br/drogas-curso, para vocês fazerem a inscrição de vocês, certo? E de vocês aproveitarem, né? Porque, afinal de contas, vocês vão ver ao longo da duração completa desse curso que é um gosto, é um prazer à parte você escutar o professor Sebastian. Não tem nenhum código, é só vocês entrarem aí, vocês vão ver as 3 opções de compra que tem lá, né? Aqui é válida até as 21 horas de hoje, é a opção que diz respeito, né, que tá lá por R$197. Depois das 21 horas o preço já vai subir, ainda vai ter um desconto de 25% de desconto, mas já vai subir para 297. E né, no final dessa semana a coisa já vai daí já vai chegar no preço cheio, porque realmente, né, pagar professor em euro está sendo uma experiência bem diferente aí para vocês. Sim, R$197 é o valor com o desconto já. O desconto vale ainda, né, para boleto, para Pix, para o jeito que vocês quiserem, tá? Não tem erro. Se vocês quiserem assistir essa aula de volta, não há problema algum, certo? Essa aula vai ficar aberta para vocês fazerem, para vocês assistirem quando vocês quiserem. Ela vai ficar disponível aqui no nosso canal, como também uma forma de garantir que, se você não pode fazer a tua inscrição agora, né, por mais que se perca o desconto, você ainda assim, né, no futuro pode assistir, pode fazer, pode voltar. Fica o nosso convite para que vocês de fato participem desse curso, porque foi uma experiência muito edificadora. Nós tivemos uma experiência nova também. Aliás, aproveitando, né, você começou a falar de drogas aqui, drogas legais, eu já fui. Bom, quem acompanha as lives do Introcrim já sabe que, né, que os vícios aqui são bem claros. E É isso, gente. Eu quero falar que... Ó, vamos ver, deixa eu até ver. Quanto custa essa aula? Quanto custa esse curso em euros? Ó, gente, 30 euros um curso. Pô, é um curso completo. 4 aulas com o professor Sebastian por 30 euros. Vamos falar o quê? 30 euros não paga nem... Não paga... Porra, 30 euros não paga um terço da hora aula dele. Dê uma força aí pra gente também. A aula vai ficar disponível, como eu disse, vai ficar disponível aqui. Aproveitem até as 21 horas. Essa live vai ficar disponível. Essa live não, esse preço com desconto vai ficar disponível. A partir daí, aí a gente já vai ter, até para conseguir arcar com os custos da produção do curso, né? Toda legendagem, todo esse material, a gente vai ser obrigado já a diminuir o desconto, certo? Eliette está perguntando se era maconha que estava no cachimbo da outra vez. Não era. Nossa senhora, eu tenho muito respeito pro pessoal que gosta da erva e que, mais importante que isso, consegue trabalhar com isso, né? Nossa, tá louco. Aqui é só tabaco, café, esse tipo de coisa que é o que a gente acaba consumindo. E é isso, meus queridos, né? Eu vou ficar à disposição, tá certo? Se vocês quiserem, mandem mensagem lá no Instagram. Eu vou estar no Instagram aí até 21 horas, garantindo que vocês tiverem qualquer dúvida, qualquer problema, vocês me avisem lá, porque para eventualmente, né, a gente ver o que consegue fazer. Mas é isso, meus queridos, né? Eu quero agradecer a presença de todos, a participação de todos, e quero enfaticamente sugerir que vocês façam esse curso. A gente chegou no limite do que pode fazer, mas é a nossa forma de agradecer e de incentivar vocês, né, a continuarem estudando, mesmo em épocas tão difíceis quanto as nossas. Sophie, não tá ainda no nosso site aberto. Como eu disse, ele tem que dar uma olhada, tem que entrar nesse /drogas-curso aqui, porque esse é um preço que está disponível apenas para quem está assistindo aqui ao vivo, na live. A gente não liberou ainda por lá justamente por isso. Para não chegar, né? Que veja, né? Também se chegasse não era tanto problema, mas a ideia é justamente de incentivar vocês que participaram. Eu joguei agora de volta aqui no chat, só usar esse link, copia, cola, né? Ele está aqui na tela também para vocês usarem, e é isso. Queridos e queridas, eu estou à disposição até 21 horas, esse preço está válido. Um beijo para vocês.